So like every developer, I've been naming things my entire professional career, and that's quite a long time. And really, I only mention this because it'll become relevant later. So I started off with doing things that we called just markup patterns back at Griffith Uni. I will admit it was 2000. We didn't know what a design system was back then. We didn't have that sort of naming, but it's also worth remembering that at the time, SVN was blowing people's minds. It was kind of a bit of a different time. I went on and did similar stuff at News Limited, went on to work on Atlassian's first UI library from version 3 to 5 and the very first version of ADG. Just putting that out there because later on I'm going to throw slides up about that, and that's where they're all coming from. I also worked on Big UI V2 for BigCommerce, built ACE for Ansarada. You'll see screenshots of all of these, and I'm currently doing a new one for Quantium. Now, two reasons I mentioned all of that. One was to introduce the fact that I've done a lot of these, and therefore I think I have probably made every mistake that is possible to make doing this sort of stuff. I will talk about some of those. And the other thing, it really is true that there are two hard problems in computer science: cation validation, naming things, and off by one errors. It's very, very true. But the more I thought about this joke, I love this joke, I really do, but the more I thought about it, I kept thinking, why does naming come into this? And then you sort of think about it that I also, when I sat down to write this presentation, thought, why have I had so many massive arguments about naming something? Why do people care so much? You know, why do I care so much? And I started doing a bit of reading and that kind of thing. Naming things really taps into like fundamental psychology. Stuff that we don't consciously process goes on. When you hear a name, when you put a name to something, you have all kinds of things going on. We have ideas that transcend language. This is an experiment that Wolfgang Kohler did in 1929. He showed a whole bunch of people these two shapes. One of these is Maluma, and one of these is Taketi. Which do you think is which? Now, it's not 100%, but it's in the high 90s. Yeah, the roundy one is Maluma, and the jagged one is Taketi. And if you saw Tim Kadlec talk at Web Directions Code, you might recognize this, which is from 2001, when people reproduced those results with Kiki and Booba. So different category, different people, different shapes, and yet the results were the same. And we have lots of other really curious language associations. There's things like north is uphill and south is downhill. People think they're going to get more tired going north. Like, this is all research, by the way. I've geeked out reading some weird shit lately. And then there are really funny ones, like companies with short, simple names. When they go on the market and no one knows much about them yet, the short names trade better for a little while before they get known and real trading kicks in. So it's really quite weird. And then it gets really strange, because some research put out in 2017 by the American Psychological Association says that you fit your name subconsciously. You start to fit your own name. And I thought, this is bollocks, right? But it's like, okay, we think Bob is going to have a rounder face than Tim. And if you just bang Bob and Tim into Google, guess what? It sort of turns out to be true. So I don't know if Bob was thinking about this, but you know. The point I'm making here is that people react to names subconsciously. It's not a process that we go, oh, I'm going to think about this, and now you've given it that. It happens really, really quick. It happens on a lower level that we're really kind of aware of. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, people have really strong opinions about names. I've also found that people often struggle to explain why. Like, why do they hate that name and they love that name? They're terrible at actually expressing this. And so when we do things about our design system should match expectations, you've got this problem, right? Whose expectations? Because everyone's going to have different ones. And is everybody a stakeholder? Because it's easy to say everyone's a stakeholder. And I'm going to say something slightly controversial here, but I want to be clear that I'm going to talk about the thing that we work on, the actual design system, the implementation, the bit when we go from IP into actual reality and we start making things. Because at that point, the user is not actually a stakeholder. They are a massive stakeholder, the only real stakeholder that matters with what we build with these design systems. But the system itself, what we name or something behind the scenes, doesn't matter. They don't care. It's that whole thing of like sausages. They sort of don't want to know. They just want to sort of enjoy what comes out. They don't want to get too deep into how you made it. And I think that's kind of right. Users don't care. It's very rare that you actually know about a design system's name, that kind of thing. Like we do because we're all into it, but we're not typically users in that sense. We're researching our job. So we can sort of look at three broad stakeholder categories. There's the business, like everyone who's not a dev or a designer or anything, like people across the business who nevertheless have an influence over your project. Then you have designers and developers. And I'm going to focus in on this excluding a few things that I could get into, and I could talk about consuming developers versus central developers, but I'm just going to keep it broad. And there are things to name. So we've got the design system itself, then the UI library that implements the design system, and the patterns and the components and all that kind of stuff. And then you get down to like the hardcore implementation, the design assets, the code assets. And you put these things together, and you start getting a bit of some sort of shape to who's going to have which arguments, who needs which kind of communication, and how this is all going to go. And I think you can split this up into two very broad categories. There's branding and there's implementation. Branding is that thing that reaches out across the business, that everyone has a bit of a say or will come in contact, and something that has to make sense to people who don't get the tech particularly. And that's where a really good name can really, really help. And I think that, as people have said earlier on tonight, you want to have a bit of fun with it. I think you want to separately name the design system from the UI library, because otherwise you end up having conversations like how did answer writer of ACE the library versus ACE the system. What do you mean? What? So you just call them two different things. That's just going to save you some time. You want something short and easy to say. That sounds really silly, but if you name something and it's got like a 6-7 syllable name and you say it 50 times a day, you are going to get so tired of it. So pick something short. I think the best one ever was at Answer Writer where JT named it ACE, which stands for JT wanted it to be ACE. It actually was Answer Writer Common Element, but it was just a backronym. Do beware of phonetics though. What is it? Atlassian, we worked on Atlassian UI, AUI. And despite Lachlan's best efforts to make it AUI, it did not turn out to be AUI because everyone called it OWI. So I spent several years working on something that sounds like a toddler exclaiming in pain. And that's not good branding, I tell you now. And it was much like the same sort of problem happened to the design language itself, because the original one was not called ADG, it was called the PDL, Product Design Language. And after a bit of piddling about, and people started calling it the PD elephant in the room, that name died. It just didn't work. And sometimes you've got to let go of a name and take the pain of changing. So at Quantium, we've gone for something a little bit more serious for design language. It was already established as Quantium Design System. QDS is easy enough to say. Everything at Quantium is Q something, like everything, all the products, everything. The strategy that encompasses all of this is just called Q. So I got in and the name of the library was also QDS, and I was like, I'm not having this. I'm not having that problem all over again. So I renamed it Qubit, because qubit, quantum bits, they're very, very small things that can have multiple states. I think that's a pretty good name. And then took that through and had fun with it all the way down. So the components of qubits, and then when you put them together into patterns, they're Q pieces. And I've already seen that out in all hands meetings, people talking about, okay, we've got the bits and pieces of the UI coming. It's bad, but it works. Then we move on to implementation, which is kind of just this massive thing down the side. I'll break it up in a second. You really cut the business users out. When you get into actually building things, they don't care anymore. And that's fine. That means you've got more freedom. But it also means there's a lot of detail that you are there to handle. And naming for this, really, I think this is where we say that changing names later is hard, because there's just so many things. That simple name change I've made for Qubit, I've spent days doing things like renaming builds, renaming repos, moving build projects around. It's all right. And you get everything, even teams can be named according to these things. And that gets really, really hard. So you want to do these decisions up front if you can, but if you have to make the change, just make the change, but do it as soon as you can. And then you see the code where everything, all the way down through your code, goes down from these names. They're all affected by these names. And so that's one of those things that people get very change averse, because they're like, oh, I just can't be bothered. I don't want to go and change that template. It's a bit too much at once though. You can't really make a lot of sense out of this. So let's break it down. This, I think, is the interesting thing. Components and patterns, the things you call in your library, like, is it a star, is it a pin, is it a that, is it a dialog, is it a modal? I'll go into these in a second. These are things that do impact all that naming later on, but they most immediately impact how you all get on between design and dev. So it's really about collaboration and communication. Because designers and devs come together and they both have two very strong domains. They're both essentially coming off training and experience and that kind of stuff, and they basically both sides know they're right. And I'm sure we've all seen this cartoon because it comes up, right? It's perspective. They are both right, which is why they can't ever agree on something unless you make an effort. And the key there is just empathy and a willingness to learn. And this is where it actually gets really cool, because you can stop just being a dev or just being a designer and start learning the other side, and you get better at it. And some people end up crossing over entirely because of this. I'm going to talk about a couple of war stories for this one. Common conundrum, these I've seen across just about every company. menus, drop-downs, and selects, and dialogs, modals. I'll show you what I mean by this. Most designers I've worked with insist that there are menus in forms. Most devs insist there are not. The designers insist there are because the user comes and picks something from a set, and the developer goes, but no, it's called a select. Here, right here in the code, look right here. But then you look around and you think, well, hang on, we've got this thing that also is kind of selecting from it. And we've got, oh shit, we've got this thing that's kind of selecting. If we call all these menu, how are we ever going to discuss what's in the new page? This one's actually fairly easy because a select and a drop down and a navigation menu actually are different enough that you just drop the word menu and you don't use it at all. Because select, drop down, and nav are differentiated. They work a little bit differently and they look a bit different in most systems. Unless you go, if you make them all look the same, you're actually really not helping your user, but that's another story. The conversation is the important thing. We found the designers didn't know form semantics. They actually didn't know enough about the implementation to understand why select couldn't have things like icons in it. It's so hard to do, it's very expensive. You can still do it, but it's a choice. It's going to cost a lot. And the devs didn't understand HCR concepts. They were used to thinking about just markup. They weren't thinking about what is the user doing, what defines this interaction from another one. And nobody was looking at components as part of a suite. This was particularly true in the early days at Atlassian, where we'd put up things on the wall and have a design jam on this one bit. And we'd thrash on it with no context whatsoever. And it was only when we started looking at the whole suite, we're like, oh, well, that clearly can't have that name. And things just fell away. You've got to look out where you're going, look at the whole set. This one's great. Dialogs, okay. Most developers I know have a very strong opinion about what a dialogue is, myself included in the past. They expect something that looks a bit like this, or maybe it looks a bit like this, still very dialogue-y. But this is where it went completely bonkers. This thing came along at Atlassian, there was a massive party about this. The designers were dead set this had to be called a dialogue. And the developers just went, what are you smoking? That is not a dialogue. You know, dialogues pop up and you do dead set on it. And after some massive fights, and if you've never witnessed Atlassians arguing, trust me, there's no hill too small to die on. And so, you know, I made myself super unpopular saying, look, the devs aren't going to buy this. We could just move on to something else. After a long time, we came back and it was changed to be called the focus task page, which was clumsy, but at least it wasn't dialogue and we could move on with our lives. The funny thing was that sometimes you get this co-evolution thing where at Big UI, in a 5-minute conversation, it just turned into focus page. I'm like, sweet, ship it. We're not having this conversation. But we went all the way back the other way at Ansarada. We got this thing, and I was on holidays at the time, so I couldn't cheat and say, just call it focus page. Page dialogue confused the hell out of the devs. They look in the page docs, they look in the dialogue docs. It looks like a dialogue, but it's not modal. Oh, confusing. But the conversation was fantastic. Because we worked out the usability of code. We talked about how the code itself needs to be easy to get on with, to do things with. We learned about what a dialogue is versus what modal interaction's about. And that was a huge brain breaker for most devs because we just conflated these things to this one example we'd always lived with. But the really good stuff, and this was both at Atlassian, Ansarada as well, we had the same conversation that modals were totally overused. They were a bailout. Because people didn't want to change the page, a new feature would get added, and they're like, oh, I can't fit it. I know, I'll put it in a dialogue. I've got lots of room now, and before you know it, your entire product's dialogues. Guess what? Users hate dialogues. And we also had this great conversation about what it is to focus human attention. Like the user needs to do this one task. How will we direct them to that? And instead of just saying, well, we'll make it impossible to interact with anything else, doing it a little bit more gently, thinking a little bit more about where they are. So now that you've actually got something going, you've got a bit of a way to talk about what things should be called in the first place. There's implementation. This is the hardcore implementation. And right down here, this is where the two sides can really just do whatever they want, but generally they end up actually matching things because by now you've got momentum. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I will say that design APIs are going to get a lot more complex in the next few years. The tools have finally started to seriously evolve. I think we had nothing much in design space for a long period. Now we've got things like Sketch and Figma coming along where you are getting close to the day that a designer will change something in Sketch or Figma and break the build. Very exciting, very scary, but watch this space. I think sometime we should get Moran to come back and show you stuff. I will call attention to one thing here. Semver inside Figma from the designers without prompting from the devs. It is possible, people. Not everyone names it final, screw you, final. Naming for technical implementation. Now, we got a great rundown of this earlier on, so I'm going to just touch on a few little bits and pieces. Obviously, this is the code API zone. This is where I've lived. The goals here are, again, you can put some broad categories around them. There's functionality. The thing just has to actually work. You need to have more than one thing that could have a similar name, not clashing with each other. You want extensibility. Don't name yourself into a corner where you can't name the new thing, like the menu problem. Usability of code or developer ergonomics. And longevity. How long will this API last? How long before you actually have to make a breaking change and everyone hates you? A couple of don'ts before I do the positives. Never old and new. Just never. Straight up, blanket, never. Because new becomes old, and then old is even older, and then just put a number on it. Call it generation 1 and 2 if you have to. If you think you're at generation 3, just start there. Doesn't really matter. This is one of those great ones where I'm going to give you two conflicting bits of advice, but the balance is where you're going to find happiness, which is avoid unnecessary specifics, but beware of inappropriate generalization. Inappropriate specifics include the company name. When I was at News Corp, we had this thing across the top of all the sites called well, it was a network bar, but it was called the News Interactive Network Bar, or NIN bar. And that's great until we got rebranded to NDM. And someone came in and said, oh, we're going to change the NIN bar to the NDM bar. I said, no way, it's just going to be called the network bar. Yeah, I lost that one. Newscom AU was running the NIN bar until about 4 weeks ago, because I checked ahead of this talk. And it hasn't been called News Interactive for about 8 or 9 years, so that was great. That was really obvious. But do set your naming basics early and try and be consistent from there on out. Try and have a look at the whole suite of things you're going to be building out and see how those names are going to mesh together. And you can actually do all this with type definitions. There's lots of great type systems now that will help you do this. At Answerada, before we built our React thing, we actually built out just an app that did nothing more than define the API, built out in Elm with custom types. It made sense at the time. But what it did was it found all the places we'd been inconsistent, little inconsistencies, and we kept doing it over and over again. The biggest thing I think that helps is to assume your design will change, 100%. It's red today, it's going to be orange next week. It's this big today, it's going to be that big next week. Assume everything will change and build your system accordingly. Don't hyper-analyze everything, don't make it ridiculous, but just simple things like, it's not always going to be 200 pixels wide on the left. It's going to change. And just don't make a thing called 200 pixels. It's just, simple things. The basics really come from your namespace, picking a methodology, a few big ones like plurals. Do you say the button component or the buttons component? Sounds simple, but I tell you what, when you're writing your import and you can't remember if it's buttons, plural, or singular, that's going to really piss people off, and you're going to make mistakes and you're eventually going to break something. These little gotchas sort of add up, and there are things like wrappers, like what do you call something that goes around a set of things? Really, really dead simple, old school way of doing things is you start with your namespace, and then you go down through that hierarchy of least specific down to the most specific. Try to keep that direction going. Don't create the American date format of naming systems. You want to sort of, have a look, there's a logic to it. And so in Qubit, we have QButton primary and then QButton primary disabled, so the modifier comes on the end. You can make this BEM if you want to, it's fine, it doesn't really matter. The point is to set this up front and think about how this will impact everything and sort of write out some pseudocode and see how it's going to work. And even if you've gone the full hipster and you do everything in JavaScript and you don't have CSS classes anymore, you still have a bunch of stuff you've got to refer to, and you will hit the same problem. If you don't have a good naming scheme, you'll just reproduce the same naming issues that you had in another technical arena. So, what are you going to do? Like, element's easy, and then the variance for it's not so bad, but when you're 10 props deep, what are you going to do? So think about this stuff. Already covered the plurals, I'll spin on. Containers, what I mean about containers, you have one button, sweet. You have two buttons, okay, what are we going to do? We've got to put them in something. I've got to put some padding because of this. It doesn't matter what you pick. Again, it's about saying you're going to have this pattern a lot of times. Figure out, do you refer to sets in your language? Do you call them groups? Or do you build a wrapper around them? You talk about the contextual way you combine them. This sort of terminology starts helping you when you extend the system later on, because people sort of understand how you got to this API. If you just set an API and don't explain it, no one ever understands, and they always get it wrong when they add it, and then you get inconsistency, and it's that kind of thing that you set up front and try and document these rules. T-shirt sizing. Oh, this is so useful. Just start with this. And the biggest thing here is set your default to be medium. Most of the time you've got enough sizes. A lot of elements won't have all of them. Like, a lot will have lots of bigger ones, but not many smaller ones. It's pretty rare that you have anything that has more sizes than this that doesn't need some dedicated solution. Although I guess it probably should be like it, love it, got it, have it, you know. Dimensions, this was a classic one. I messed this up in ACE with the buttons. When we first started out, we had all the buttons the same height, but they had different widths. And we're in a hurry, call it size. That's great. And 3 years in and someone wants a height. Ah, crap. And so now we had to go back and say, well, we can now have size and height, and now we're mixing our terminologies. That's a bit weird. Do we make a breaking change and make width and height? What are we going to do here? So I'm not going to go through every last thing. It's more about saying that these are things you have to think about up front. Have a think about how these things hang together. And semantics do have limits. Like I used to think that 100% of everything had to have a semantic name. I genuinely once tried to get left and right to be like natural, as in natural language direction, and counter, so counter the natural. Oh God, sometimes left is just left, okay? It's okay, some utilities are all right. And similar thing is schemes have limits. Like just because you could say that, you know, tow truck should be car, and like, I had this beautiful naming system about content and all this kind of stuff, and then there was page content. I ended up with this one element which was something along the lines of like page content body page or something like this. It was ludicrous, but it was one of those things that in my perfect little system it was so consistent, and everyone else was like, dude, you seriously need a holiday. So be consistent and tidy, but don't fight human nature. When there's something that is essentially random, but every other human expects that Maluma Tiketi thing of they're just going to naturally expect it to be called something, just go with it. API longevity, I'll spin through some of these, but because I know we've got the devs in the room are going to understand what this is about. You want to minimize the surface for change. Just because you've got all those things I listed before with a name in them doesn't mean that you need to expose all of them and support all of them. So you be clear about what your API is and what the limit of that is. Keep as much as you can behind it and buffer out changes as much as you can. I'll explain what I mean here. So breaking change, first off, just means that something you put out there that worked no longer works unless people do work. Really good sentence, that one, isn't it? You're causing them to have to change their code just to stay where they were. That's a breaking change, and it tends to really upset people. But what you can do to avoid this is you say, okay, we've got an API, we're going to put out buttons and modals and all this kind of stuff. We only support the templates. If you go and do raw HTML, it's up to you to keep track. That's a massive one. It frees you of all kinds of issues. Specify that you only support what in the documentation, because I'd have this problem particularly at Atlassian. People would spelunk through the deepest, darkest recesses of this code base that, you know, none of us knew what was in there in some corners. Like, oh, it was there, but you have to support it now. Like, it's not in the docs. So specify that. Actually say, if we don't document it, it's a dark feature and you're on your own. And page objects, if you don't know about them, there's for testing. It's sort of like templates for tests. So if you write something that has to click the menu on every page, it calls to the template that finds a menu. It doesn't go and find that element. And it means if you change your navigation markup or something like that, you don't have to go and change 1,000 tests. You just change one page object. And you can ship them together with the library. And so everything that the breaking change arrives with the things that solve it. So these are things you should be thinking about up front about. Basically, the day you break ground on your code base, think about the day you're going to break it and how you're going to make that day as nice as possible for everybody. Think through that life cycle from the day you think of the idea to the day you delete it from the code base because no one uses it anymore. If you know what that flow is, you'll be a lot happier than if you make that up at the time. If you must break something, don't overthink it. You just make a new one that doesn't clash with the old one, put them side by side, let them stew for a while, give people a bit of time, and then you delete the old. It's called deprecation. It's not called depreciation, but it's all, again, just naming. And that can be super simple. Buttons, buttons too. It doesn't really matter. People will argue, but it doesn't really matter. We've mentioned Semver. If you really want to hear more about that, I've done an entire talk. I won't go into it tonight. Semver is really the numbering of things, and that makes it a story for another day. So the last thought here, naming does affect everything, and that's completely overwhelming if you let it get to you. But break it up into these three categories. Talk about branding your design system where you sort of win hearts and minds. Frame communication with your team so you get great collaboration. Maybe you even learn something and you get on better than you did before. And then set your API for the implementation. Actually, the hard yards at the end of actually making it happen. If you break it up and think about the different requirements, the different use cases you have in those different categories, it sort of makes it more manageable. You can eat it one bite at a time. And if you do all that, hopefully, you can tame the naming beast and you're going to win the game of naming things. Thank you very much.